Welcome to the Middle Belt, one of the most culturally diverse regions on the planet Earth, with a complex history. In this episode, we'll be exploring the origins and early development of this region. The Middle Belt is located in central Nigeria, covering an area spanning from Adamawa State in the east to Niger State in the west. It is often referred to as the breadbasket of Nigeria due to its fertile soil and agricultural productivity. The region is home to over 300 distinct ethnic groups, making it one of the most diverse regions in the world.
I'm Philip Hayab John. I am a scholar, I would say, with all sense of humility. I come from a village that is called Rikal in my language, and when you translate it, it will be to eat stones. I come from the Ham ethnic group of central Nigeria, even though the government will want us to feel that we are from northwest Nigeria, but it's incorrect. We actually are in the middle of Nigeria. My ethnic group is located where the famous Nok culture was discovered or excavated. I think that's the word we should use, because it was there, but excavated back to life. And as a child, I had the privilege of being born in what is today Benue State in Boko, when my father was a soldier, and I grew up in Makurdi town up till the time my father retired, voluntarily retired from the army in 1979, and we went back to my village in Kaduna State, where I learned my language, enrolled in primary school, and then further my education to secondary, then to the university. And I've had the privilege of being interested in defining who I am as a person, even from the introduction I was talking about, coming from central Nigeria. Well, other people will want me to be seen as a northwestern Nigerian. So that is actually the kind of dilemma of the situation with which I was raised. So when I started studying, I studied BA Literature at the Ahmadu Bello University Zaria. Before then, I'd actually studied for a diploma in mass communication at the Bayero University Kano. And I wanted to study mass comm anyway, but somehow Kano did not admit me, so I came back to Zaria, where I was admitted by merit, thanks to late Professor Abdullah Mahdi, who actually believed in excellence and promoted it irrespective of where a person comes from. And from Ahmadu Bello University Zaria, I went to the University of Ghana, where I did a master's in African Studies. At this point was when I began to ask certain salient questions about who we are, where we come from, and why are we here, and what is the way forward. So with the Masters in African Studies at the University of Ghana, I went to the University of Birmingham in England, started studying African Studies, and there I met lots of people from the Middle Belt. I remember somebody from Plateau. We're trying to bring up something so that we can reinvent the happenings of the past. And then I was there 1 year, and then I moved to South Africa, University of Stellenbosch, where I also started a study not in African studies, but in African literature per se. But somehow I had met with His Lordship now, then Father Kuka, but His Lordship now Bishop Kuka, and he's like, what would you do with a degree in African literature? You should study something that can be useful to the people where you come from. And those words of His Lordship actually have impacted my life. So I now focused my study on what would be generally minority studies. So I studied African languages and now focused my study on the area of what today could be termed as the Middle Belt of Nigeria. And I've always argued, when I read and I see that there are 255 languages in Nigeria, just the Middle Belt will have more than 255 languages, because states like Adamawa of today, Kaduna State, Plateau State, these three states will produce more than 160 languages. When you bring Nasarawa, which will have about 25 or 28, you bring in Kogi, you bring in other states, the Middle Belt will definitely account for more than those 250 that people refer to, which means that the Middle Belt has been underrepresented. And that is where I focus my research. And I had privilege of reading literature, very old literature, because I did an Erasmus program at the University of Hamburg in Germany. And I discovered that the Germans were interested in what is today northern Nigeria, even earlier than the British. Yeah, so that was how I came into this kind of literature. For instance, the German had what they call the Colonial Institute, where they were collecting literature or collecting data about our area. So I had the privilege of reading this. And yes, to a large extent, I can talk about a version of the history of the Middle Belt from an insider's point of view. Yes, so I do not claim that I have all the history of the Middle Belt, but I do believe that the history of the Middle Belt that we talk about is something that can take us to where the whole struggle that is called the Middle Belt actually began. I mean, from our own perspective and from our own point of view.
The name is Reverend James Pam. I started out as a banker. I have a master's in banking and finance, worked in the banking industry for about 20 years, then lectured for another 13 years. Then I was pastoring for 17 years. But I picked interest in Middle Belt affairs because I had personal experiences, more like I was baptized into it through experiences. Now, when I got to realize what was going on, I joined the Middle Belt movement way back in 2010, which was then called Middle Belt Dialogue, and learned a lot more and met a lot of Middle Belters. Then in 2012, I started a Middle Belt group, the Association of Middle Belt Ethnic Nationalities, ASOMBEN for short. By 2019, we brought 10 Middle Belt groups together and formed another one, the Middle Belt Congress, which was duly registered with the government. And along the line, I've written a lot. Most like that's one of the papers that you saw. I've written a lot on the Middle Belt, and I've studied a lot to find out what the Middle Belt is all about. And thank God where we are. I was in Abuja just last week, still pushing the Middle Belt cause. I gave a press conference in which I made certain suggestions and forwarded them to the President of Nigeria and the National Assembly, the political leadership of the country. Yes. Now I'm retired. Thank you. Thank you.
Early ideas about a unique geographical space in central Nigeria include the one by Dr. Kalkum, a German missionary, who suggested in 1907 to the British colonial government that a Benue region be created for both Christians and the colonial administration. Another idea about the Middle Belt was by E.D. Murrell, an influential British journalist and editor of the British African Mail, who in 1911 proposed the creation of a central region for non-Muslims and cultural minorities. A third proposal was submitted in 1913 by C.L. Temple, a geographer and an experienced colonial civil servant, who proposed that Lagos Colony be left as it was, but the northern and southern protectorates be broken into 6 groups, 3 in the north and 3 in the south. He proposed a Benue group of provinces in the north, comprising Plateau, Southern Bauchi, Southern Zaria, Wukari, and Benue provinces. The other 2 groups in the north he called Hausa Group of Provinces and Chad Group of Provinces. So the idea of carving out a middle area in the north was made 3 times between 1907 and 1913.
Yes. Now, the whatever today is the Middle Belt is a complex community. Based on some of the early records, for instance, Greenback as a linguist. So yes, I have studied history, but I come from a linguistic background. Greenback had once described the Middle Belt as the most linguistically diverse community, or if you say region, in the world, next only to New Papua Guinea. Wow. Only New Papua Guinea has more languages than you would find in the Middle Belt, or what the area that is referred to as the Middle Belt of Nigeria today. Now, the interesting thing, however, is that with all these diverse languages that are present in the area of the Middle Belt that we're talking about, these people who are found in this locality actually have shared cultural outlook, shared cultural beliefs, and they have shared social cultural organizations. So when you go to an average village in the Middle Belt, you would find that the elders are the most reputable, not just chiefs that we now have today, elders. Then in those days, the chief priest would be the most maybe reputable, followed by council of elders who served as advisors. And then you have the clan, or the lineage or the clan, and then you have the family unit. And so we were connected. Cultural researchers, anthropologists will argue that we couldn't have had this commonality of shared cultures, shared social organization, shared belief system, if we had not lived in the same place so many years in the past. So when the British colonial government established itself in northern Nigeria by 1903, colonialism was fully established in northern Nigeria. Indirect rule now began. Now, the British colonial government was interested in the established system of what you can call the caliphate. Now, so here you have a hereditary emir, you have people who worked with the emirs, and then taxation and all that. So this was for convenience, and the British colonial government collapsed everybody in the then Northern Protectorate, as we had referred, into the northern region. But the researchers or the scholars who have actually made reference suggesting to the British colonial government to create a new region, they came in contact with our people and could see clearly in the vast area then that covered what is today the Middle Belt, beginning from southern Borno to Adamawa, you come to Kogi, you come to what is today Benue, you come to what is today Plateau, you come to what is today southern Kaduna, you go to Niger, you go to even southern Zulu, southern Kebbi rather, I should say now. And you would find that these groups actually had the same structure in terms of their organization. They had a language other than Hausa and Fulfulde. And therefore they had a belief system which was theocratic, the worship of the ancestral spirits, which was mediated by the chief priests. We all had all this, these groups that I've called, and that if you look at these localities, you find different ethnic groups. Today, Taraba, yes, and all that. However, at this time, there were only few kingdoms. When the British colonial government met with us, there were few kingdoms. That would be what is today what is maybe referred as the Kororofa, the Jukun kingdom, the Igala kingdom. I'm not sure, based on my reading, the Nupe also had a very vast conquest. Nupe had a very vast conquest. They had conquered lots of places and have gone far. So they also had, a sort of a structure that looked like that of the caliphate. That is why you see a very strong presence of Islam in Nupe land today. But they did not copy, to my mind, based on my reading. They didn't copy, they actually established this by conquest. But the other groups were not engaged in conquest. They were okay with their lands. They were okay with their interrelationships with these other ethnic groups surrounding them. But that was not the way it was with the Hausa Sarauta system. Therefore, there was a difference between these groups and the Fulani Hausa Caliphate. So the suggestion came as a result of this. In fact, Lord Lugard himself, through one of the colonial officers of the time called Scotino, in a book that he wrote about what is today Nasarawa province, or then Nasarawa province, then later you had, it was Munchi province even, to refer to the Tiv, which they rejected until 1926 that it became Benue province. Now, he had actually also said that these groups had to run to the hills to defend themselves from the scourge of the domination of the Hausa Caliphate. So it was this kind of reality that they saw. The semblance of what they saw in Benue was the semblance of what they would see in Taraba, or of today Taraba, what we see in southern Borno. And then they discovered that, yeah, these people were different in organization, and therefore they should be put together into a group. Now, the colonial government did not listen at the time that she was supposed to listen, unfortunately, but this is the reality. So, yes, with C.L. Temple, a geographer, reputable geographer, he has a publication about the geography of northern Nigeria. I think the paper was published in 1913. So that was quite early. And he was talking about the topography. So you look at the rainfall in the most parts of the Middle Belt. What is today the Middle Belt today? You see, it is high rainfall. Look at what we farm, the farm produce. We farm sorghum, we farmed millet, then we have cocoyam, which has always been with us. And some of us farmed fonio, that is often referred to as acha in Hausa, or hungry rice, some people want to call it, but the name is fonio. So we all had this kind of crops. We had farming seasons, we had bands, and these bands were built in the same way. So this shared culture was the reason that propelled the proposers to say a new region, or a region, and indeed a region that was central, because most of these groups are sort of found mostly in what is central Nigeria. So you have Kogi, you have parts of Kwara, you have you have what is today Benue, you have what is southern Kaduna, you have the Plateau. Now, culturally, these areas have semblances. In fact, some of the cultures the same, they just speak different languages. And even in the languages, some researchers have shown that there are certain words that you find cut across in languages in the Middle Belt, and the word is the same. For instance, tat will mean 3 in many languages in the Middle Belt. Now, that is not by accident. It cannot come by accident. It came as a result of contact. And so the justification that there should be a Middle Belt zone, or to be a central zone, that is how this whole name came about, and we are where we are today. So it came with facts. It wasn't based on emotions, but it was based on evidence of language, based on evidence of shared culture and social organization system.
The motivation was quite simple. The Danfodio jihads, the Islamic jihads of 1804 up to 1808, gave the Fulanis the opportunity to rule over a lot of the areas in northern Nigeria. And so Islamic rule was fairly established in the far north, northwest, and the northeast of the country. When the British colonialists, through Lord Lugard, conquered northern Nigeria by 1903, they discovered that they didn't have enough personnel, colonial personnel. I understand they were just about 30-something. But the area they had to administer, the whole of the northern region, was too vast. And Lord Lugard had had an experience. Lord Lugard was actually born in India. He worked for the British government in India and introduced indirect rule. He also used it in Uganda. So with that experience, he came up with the idea of indirect rule in northern Nigeria. Indirect rule simply means use the structures that are on ground. And he found that the Fulani Emirate system was well established and very efficient. And so he decided to use it. By using it, the areas that were not conquered in the jihads now came under the Emirate system. And what was the jihad all about? It was Islamic expansionism. And these areas that were not conquered, which we now call the Middle Belt, had African traditional religionists and they had Christians. Because remember, Christian missionaries had already come here way back in the 18th century and started their evangelism. So there were Christians in these parts, there were animists, and there were also Muslims. But the non-Muslims were far in number. Now, the Islamic emirs overreached their authority. They beat, they imprisoned easily. Their legal system was the Sharia system, and people resented it. Also, the political party, dominant political party belonged to them. That was then the NPC, Northern People's Congress. And even though others tried to enter into partnership with them, they would renege. So there was a lot of disgruntlement against the Emirate system and against Islamic rule. Islam was trying to force itself on people. And because of those protests, dislike of Islam and Islamic system, people started coming together to form groups that would resist and ask for self-determination. Let's not forget also that the slave trade had ended just over 100 years earlier. The Fulanis were heavily involved in slave trade. They were slavers. They used to carry out slave raids from northern Nigeria down in the northwestern area up to Kontagora, Yauri area, if at the Nupe land, Mina, Bida, catching young men and selling them to North Africans. Also in the northeast of the country, the Kanuris were involved in slaving too. They used to come down as far as Yobe, Gombe, Bauchi, Adamawa to catch slaves and sell to the Arabs from North Africa. So generally the people in the Middle Belt area disliked Islam because Islam and slavery went together. They disliked the ascendancy of Islam, which was trying to force them to imbibe it. When school started, education started also, in the schools, Hausa was used. And the natives in the Middle Belt area, who had over 200 different languages spoken and about 600 dialects, didn't like the idea of sending their children to school and they being taught Hausa. They said their languages will die, their cultures will die. Hausa will become the lingua franca. And so there was a lot of resentment. And from about 1920 up to 1950, people started coming together and they formed initially town meetings, then tribal unions, and different types of associations all over the country. For example, in this area where we are now, Birom Tribal Union became the mouthpiece reporting to the colonialists their disgruntlement and what they didn't like. We had the Kanuri Youth Movement, the Kanuri Development Association, we had the Habe Development Association, Igbira, Parapo, and so many of them. Now, by the 1940s, tribal unions were the voice of the people. As Britain was thinking of granting independence, what we call the nationalists have started agitations for independence. Political parties had to be formed. And these tribal unions and associations slowly started metamorphosing into political parties. But your question is about the idea of creating a separate area. Now, I gave that background to take us now back to 1907. Kalkum was a missionary, as you rightly said. And when he came to Nigeria, he actually arrived in Lokoja. And his idea with his friends was that they're heading into Muslim territory in Bauchi to preach to Muslims, convert them, and stop the advance of Islam down towards the middle of the country and to the coast. He stopped in Lokoja and decided to have a word with the then Governor General, Lord Lugard, whose headquarters was in Zungeru. He went to Zungeru, spent the night with Lord Lugard and told him his plans. Lord Lugard said, no, you can't do that. Why? Because through the indirect rule system, there was an agreement, no preaching to Muslims. So you can't preach to Muslims. So Kalkum had to change plan. He won't go to Bauchi again. He got to Ibi and moved to Wasi. He tried preaching in Wasi, but there were already Muslims there. So he went back to Lantang and started getting people who would listen. And finally, he moved to Giel to Forum, where he set up a big mission station. Now, he discovered that Islam and Christianity and traditional religion were fighting. They cannot live together. And that is why he went back to Lord Lugard and suggested to him, create an area called a Benue region, because the non-Muslims were being called pagans or non-Mohammedans. He said, you, Lord Lugard, and your British colonial administration, why don't you create an area that we call, let's call it Benue region, and you will live there without Islam, without fighting, and also the Christians were preaching to, and the African traditionalists will have their own space. He suggested it, but it wasn't listened to. Now you rightly did mention, E.D. Murrell suggested it back in the UK. He was the editor of the British African Mail and a very influential, social influencer, I call them today. And he made a suggestion in 1911 that it is necessary to create an area because Islam and Christianity just will not live together happily. Let's create what we call a central area and let it be for cultural minorities and for Christians or for non-Muslims. The British government toyed with the idea but didn't carry it through. The third suggestion came in 1913 through this Temple of a Man. He was a British colonialist. He was on ground. He had seen it all. So his own suggestion was really powerful. He saw the need. And he suggested that the Northern Protectorate be broken into groups of provinces, 3 groups. The Southern Protectorate broken into 3 groups of provinces. But the Lagos colony, which was the first colony the British had in Nigeria, should be left as it is. And his own idea was to create a middle region, and the middle region should comprise of these areas that were not conquered in the Fulani jihads. And many of them did not have the emirate system. They still had their chiefs. Although emirs had been set up above some of them and they resented it. So, but his suggestion was really discussed but was not approved. That was not the end. Colonialists, other British colonialists who had been on ground, after Temple's suggestion, came together again and really brainstormed about how to break up the North so that non-Muslims can have their enclaves. But it was not granted. You can guess why. The Fulani Caliphate, the Sokoto Caliphate, fought it. They fought it. Lord Lugard liked working with them. They had Islamic education. They also had a beautiful administrative system, and Lord Lugard was enjoying them for his indirect rule. Yeah. So he listened to them more than listening to the people who were complaining. And that is why the idea of carving out an area was brought up over and over again, but it was never done. Up to 1956, when a motion was actually moved on the floor of the Northern House of Assembly, formally, to create a Middle Belt region out of Northern region.
While some Nigerians have found it difficult to define the Middle Belt, the Middle Beltans have never had a problem with this. According to Reverend James Pam, the difficulties might have arisen because of the multidimensional concept of the Middle Belt. It is a geographical area, it is a combination of ethnic nationalities, it is a consciousness, and it is a political movement. As a geographical area, it is that portion of Nigerian landmass that is south of Hausa and Kanuri land and north of Yoruba and Igbo land. As a combination of ethnic groups, it is composed of all the tribes and clans that reside in the geographical area described earlier as at 1914, the date of the amalgamation of the southern and northern protectorates to form the new nation, Nigeria. As a consciousness, it is that knowledge in the conscious and subconscious of all those who don't fit into the definition of a typical northerner as perceived by other Nigerians who expect him to be either Hausa or Fulani or Kanuri and a Muslim. As a political movement, it is Middle Beltans who have banded themselves formally from about 1920 till today in tribal, sociocultural, and political associations. Examples of such Middle Belt movements include the Middle Belt Forum, Middle Belt Zone League, United Middle Belt Congress, Middle Belt People's Party, etc. Lastly, let's take a look at the definition of the Middle Belt by one of the Middle Belt sociocultural organizations that have formally registered with the Corporate Affairs Commission, CAC, known as the Middle Belt Congress, MBC. MBC defines Middle Belt in its constitution as follows: the geographical area referred to as the Middle Belt region of Nigeria, and from where the Congress draws its membership, are those territories that were part of the Northern Protectorate, but outside the sphere of authority of the Kanem-Borno Empire and the Sokoto Caliphate as of 1914, the date of the amalgamation of the Northern and Southern Protectorates. Today, this area includes wholly or partially the present Adamawa, Benue, Kogi, Kwara, Nasarawa, Niger, Taraba, and Plateau states, Southern Kaduna Senatorial District, including Kajuru and Chukum, Igabi, and Birnin Gwari LGAs in the Kaduna Central Senatorial District, Saminaka in Kaduna North Senatorial District, the Federal Capital Territory, FCT, Yauri and Zuru areas in the present Kebbi State, the old Tangalewaja and Yamal Tudeba divisions of Gombe State, Tafawa Balewa, Bogoro and Das LGAs of Bauchi State, southern part of Goza Chiefdom and Biu in southern Borno State, and Putiskum LGA in Yobe State.
The greatest blunder of the British colonial administration was its stratification of northern Nigeria into Muslims and non-Muslims. The Muslims were propped up to be the rulers, while the non-Muslims were to be the fiefdom. Several documented evidences show that the British acted favorably towards the Muslim groups of northern Nigeria, while it regarded the non-Muslims with scorn. One of such evidences is seen in the book, But Always as Friends, by the last colonial governor of northern Nigeria, Sir Brian Sherwood Smith. In the chapter, Cultural Perspectives in Northern Nigeria, Sherwood Smith expresses views which regarded the Muslims of northern Nigeria as superior and the ethnic minorities as inferior.
I think to begin with, it should be underscored that the people groups that are today referred to as the Middle Belters of Nigeria didn't have much to do with the far north, whether in terms of culture, in terms of language, no. Rather, it was the people of the far north with their interest in trade that started penetrating the areas of the Middle Belt, or what is today the Middle Belt. And there were very few travelers, often referred to as the Fatake in Hausa. And if they travel through those thick forested areas and they were not being attacked, not being killed, what does that tell you? It tells you that the people who are referred to as the Middle Belters today were actually peace-loving people, and they were open to the outside world, but they were okay within their world. Now, so the tensions would come as a result of British colonial mistake. Now, when the Northern Protectorate was created, Lagos colony was there, and then the Southern Protectorate were eventually merged. The colonial government did not take into cognizance the differences of culture, the differences in culture, the differences in language, and that will impact on the worldview of the people groups that are found in the area that we now refer to as the Middle Belt. So what the indirect rule of the British government did was to just zoom in every structure that had worked among the feudal lords in the north. And I'm talking about far north, let's say Kano. We're talking about 7 Hausa states, actually, you can talk about. Borno had its own structure there, and it was working it was working well. So when the colonial government decided to just bring indirect rule without having to do much of baseline study to see whether our people will like this structure or not, it created tensions. Now, the British colonial government had an impression of 2 sets of people in the north, the lords and the fiefdom, and our people were to be the fiefdom, and our people have not had anything to do with the far north, so why would they overnight just become subservient to them? That was one problem. The second thing was that the far north at that time was predominantly Muslim, but even in the far north there were people who were non-Muslims, who were practicing traditional religion. Now, you now bring in the system, Sarauta system, and put it down here, and the Sarauta system is being implemented with the influence of Islam. That was another level of tension. And by this time that the amalgamation was going to come in 1914, Christian missionary activities had already begun in the Middle Belt areas, which was referred to as the pagan groups by the British colonial government. So the north was classified Muslim and pagans, and these pagans were seen to be not cultured, because the colonial government did not study us. They did not understudy our people to understand our own social structure. We had the Council of Elders, so that was a social structure. We had boys who now are initiated into adulthood and they become an age grade. That is a social structure and it worked. We use it for public work, we use it for domestic work, we use it for self-actualization. So how would they say that there was no structure? There were structures, but not the kind of structures that they saw. And maybe because the British colonial government had a monarchical system where the king or the queen rules, by seeing the monarchical system which the caliphate had established, which had been there for like 100 years before the arrival of the British colonial government, they tend to be more receptive to that system. That is another. But the other thing was that because of the influence of Islam in the far north of Nigeria, some people were literate in the Islamic script that was referred to as Ajami. And therefore, when you talk about a date, they can give you the date in the Islamic calendar, which you can easily convert to the lunar calendar and you get dates. In our area, our people didn't live with dates. That's a fact. People have tried to argue it, but I've not found records showing this, whether this was 11th century, this was 12th century, no. But our people had a dating system which was entirely within their own purview to be able to know what time is this season, what time is the next season, what am I supposed to plant. So our people were also, agriculturally oriented. So they were just thinking about how to raise crops and for their subsistence. They were not interested in anybody's territory. So with the Fatake coming here, interacting with the people of the Middle Belt in villages and some towns that were imagined at that time, some of the people in the Middle Belt could speak Hausa. So now when the colonial government came, they now took these few people that could speak Hausa and assumed that the entire north of Nigeria was Hausa speaking. This is one of the resistance that you find the Kanuri have been able to establish up to today. The Kanuri will speak Hausa, but he will speak Kanuri. They do not think their language is anyway, at any point, lower than Hausa, which is the kind of feeling the colonial government tried to establish, which was unfortunate. In fact, there's one of the earliest books that I read, I've forgotten the writer, he was saying that in years to come, there will only be 4 languages spoken in Africa. And he counted Hausa as one of the languages, and English as one of the languages, French as one of the languages, and Arabic. So there was actually, if you like, a colonial project to exterminate the people groups of the Middle Belt, and therefore our people wanted our existence not to be exterminated, and they resisted it. That was going to set the pace for the struggle. So these were the tensions. So we will go to the school. Schools were mostly established by the missionaries. We will complete education, are qualified for a job, but native authority which was organized by the British colonial government, was sort of Islamic. Since the alkali, the judges could be an Islamic preacher who becomes an alkali, where is the school that they've gone to study, to come and become judges? So what do you expect? Justice? The chances I get justice was very, very slim. So these were the issues. Now with the emergence of a new identity in the Middle Belt, not just of language, but also of Christianity, the tension further built. And then that took us to the 1949 that I talked about. At the Northern House of Assembly, Northern Region House of Assembly in Kaduna, records have it that somebody became too ambitious, one of the parliamentarians, and raised a motion for the halting of Christian missionary activities in northern Nigeria. Now that already has an impact. It will have an impact in southern Kaduna, which already had an SIM station established in Koi in 1910. It will have an impact in today's Niger, which had Patigi as an SIM station, with a dictionary in Nupe already. It will have impact in Wushishi, which is today in Niger State. with an SIM station. It will have impact in Igbe, which is now in Kogi, I believe. And there was a missionary station. It will have impact in the area of Benue that Christian missionary activities was making inroads. And then you have Christian missionary activities on the plateau, and then spreading to SUM, yes, I think Sudan United Mission, that was working in the areas of today Gombe State, today Taraba State, today Adamawa, and then you had the Lutheran, you had all missionaries working. They were working in the areas that were tagged as pagans by the colonial government. Since the colonial government intentionally did not allow Christian missionary activities to thrive in the far north, except for the strong head of some of these missionaries who started mission activities in Kano, and some of them who started mission activities in far areas of what is today KB, around Zuru, and then around Bisabu and other places in the north. So this tension of trying to equate governance with the religion of Islam was one of the basic problems that was to give birth to what today we have as the Middle Belt. So like I made mention, 1949, when that motion came out, you know, it will be covered in the media. And the moment it was covered, we had an offspring. The Birom Progressive Union was very outspoken at that time. There were other progressive union or unions of ethnic groups across the north. But at that time, Birom Progressive Union was very outspoken. And the Birom Progressive Union was trying to garner the energy of all the other ethnic groups on the plateau. And that was how Patrick Doherty and David Lott at that time decided to consult very eminent northerners who were non-Muslims. And one of the strategic persons at that time, 1949, was Governor Awan, who was the then chief of an area in southern Kaduna called Kaguru, the Ogorok. These were the kind of people that they brought together and had a meeting to say, hey, we have to do something. Once we allow Christian missionary activities to be stopped, we will not get an education. We will not get jobs. And the statuses that our people were sort of not first-class citizens in their own land will be returned. And that was how this group started. And with the strength of the mission work that was in Benue at that time, being pioneered by the Dutch Reformed Church and the Evangelical Reformed missions that will bring the EARCC, the CRCN and all that, they became very strong. And that was how they came together to form the Non-Muslim Northerners League. Remember, the Second World War was just ending, and there was an establishment of the League of Nations. So the word league came from the League of Nations, which is now United Nations. Yes, so every group can be given birth using any name. Names can change, but the cause remained one. And the cause was that those northerners, or those people who are in the north, geographical north of Nigeria, who were non-Muslims, who felt not represented by the system that the British colonial government was implementing, resisted it. And the only way was to resist it on a common front. And that was how this group came. So when the Non-Muslim Northerners League could not be registered because of the name that it carried, the people or the organizers simply organized and called themselves the Middle Zone League. Now, this is the implication. The people in southern Borno, in areas like Goza, they were part of these groups. The people in southern Kebbi, Zulu area, they were part of this. People even in north of Kaduna, the likes of Professor Audu Ishaya of blessed memory, at that time he must have been a student in the university. Then the likes of Barodiko, the first northerner to earn a degree in medicine. He was native Hausa, but a Christian. So where do you think his allegiance is going to be? Definitely his allegiance would be with the Middle Zone League, because the Middle Zone League was to advocate for equality, that the known equality that the British colonial government was preaching, placing those who were Mohammedans, that is the Muslims, higher than the people that were referred as the pagans, was a lopsided system. And that is a system that maybe would have not worked in England, but the British colonial government wanted it to work here. But that aspect that some people could read and write in the North, you know, it has always been in history that people who can read and write are often thought to be of higher IQ. And people who cannot read and write, even though they have a thriving oral tradition, are being looked upon, or were being looked upon as people who are backward. That was one other effect that the British colonial system brought. And our people wanted to resist this, and they resisted it well. And that is how the Middle Belt struggle started. So the cause was, first, the humanity of everyone in the north of Nigeria, the equality of everyone in the north of Nigeria, equal access to jobs. So somebody should train to become a judge, not because he is a malam of a particular mosque that he becomes a judge. That was a lopsided system. And unfortunately, this kind of lopsided arrangements have actually filtered into today's Nigeria, where you see people occupying offices that they are not qualified to occupy. That does not bring development. It doesn't bring about development, and it needs to stop.
And this brings us to the end of the first episode, which explains the origins and early development of the Middle Belt, looking at the early ideas, definition, and the cause of the Middle Belt. In the next episode, we would look at the political movements and struggles in the Middle Belt. See you in episode 2.